I'm Charles Shapiro. I'm the president of the World Affairs Council of Atlanta. And Roman, you didn't introduce yourself to the ambassadors. I want to thank you, Roman Papaduk, who is the chairman of the board of the World Affairs Councils of America and who has organized all this down to the menu. So thank you very much. Bill told me to keep the intro short. So I'm going to do that under the assumption that all of y'all are literate and the bios are in fact in the program. So if you want the full bios, read the program, but I'm going to tell you just a little bit. Secretary Penny Pritzker is, of course, the Secretary of Commerce of the United States. She has been indefatigable, traveling around the world, working to promote U.S. business and increase U.S. exports. And inside the United States, she has participated in numerous conferences and panels talking about American competitiveness. And that's what we're going to talk about today. David Abney is the chairman and CEO of UPS, a company which is headquartered in Atlanta. If you read through the bio, you'll learn the most important thing about David is he is our immediate past chairman of the board of directors of the World Affairs Council of Atlanta. Very important. But secondly, he is the patron saint of loading dock workers around the world, because he started at UPS working on the loading dock while he was at university, and now he is the chairman of the company. So that is extraordinary. And the moderator of this session is Edward Alden, who goes by Ted Alden, who runs the competitiveness program at the Council on Foreign Relations. He also asked me, speaking of competitiveness, to make sure y'all buy his book, Failure to Adjust: How Americans Got Left Behind in the Global Economy. And if you mention his name, I think there's a discount immediately following this. But this is the most important panel of the whole conference because it is on American competitiveness. And that, when you get down to it, in many ways, is what the next 4 years are going to be about, and what the incoming administration is going to have to focus on is how do we make America more competitive. And I'm going to get out of the way and let the experts talk. So let's welcome the panel onto the stage.
Thanks very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Although I didn't hear.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Shapiro. It's great to be here at the World Affairs Council of America, and I am honored to be here with my guest, Secretary Pritzker and David Abney of UPS. So our time is limited. I am going to launch right into the questions without any extensive prelude. Secretary Pritzker, I want to start with you.
Yes.
So I think we have to start because it's on the minds of everyone in this room with the election outcome. Mm-hmm. There were obviously many reasons for Donald Trump's narrow victory, but his stance on trade had something to do with it. The states that put him over the top, Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, are all states that saw significant manufacturing job losses in the 2000s. So what went wrong? Is there a messaging problem on trade? Are there more substantive issues? How do you evaluate the role of trade in this election and what that means going forward?
I think that trade has gotten conflated with globalization and automation and digitization, and which is expressing itself in a lot of fear and angst. in many communities around our country. And so, but I think we have to untangle all that, and we have to really talk more precisely about trade and automation separately and digitization separately. And let's be really clear, trade is fundamental to American strength. It's really fundamental to our economic strength, it's fundamental to our geopolitical strength, and it's fundamental to our national security. And, you know, look, the administration worked really hard, and David Abney was one of our primary partners in the private sector to address those anxieties that were out there, but also to get trade passed and to try and explain that part of what trade can do and trade agreements can do is they can make the engagement between our country and others fair. Somehow it got to be understood the opposite. But in fact, trade agreements are how we shape the rules of trade. And they make the situation better for American companies and better for American workers, and they make us more competitive. You know, think about the labor provisions or the environmental provisions or the digital trade provisions, all of which
Of the Trans-Pacific Partnership you're talking about, of this agreement that now looks,
are to the benefit of American companies and American workers, let alone bringing down 18,000 tariffs. So to me, I think we have to separate these things apart, and I think that our message didn't permeate. And in communities where people remember a factory closing because of globalization, you know, 20 years ago, there's fear that that's the same thing would happen. The truth is manufacturing's on the rise in the United States. Manufacturing jobs are on the rise. But, you know, I've been to these communities. I've been to Lorain, Ohio, where, you know, it used to be 12,000 steel jobs, and now there's 250.
Yeah.
And I get it.
Yeah, there was a...
So I think we have to do a better job of disentangling these things. But then I also think Congress needs to do a better job of helping to address the challenges faced by individuals that are affected by globalization. And that can't be done simply by executive actions or by communities alone. We need to create more incentives for businesses to engage and help the disaffected worker who's been, you know, where their industry is changing. And, you know, whether it's tax incentives for education assistance or, you know, making employer payments. And, you know, employers often offer to retire their workers' student debts, but that's income to the student or the worker. And that's a problem, because that may be, you know, $5,000 or $10,000 that person doesn't have at that moment. We need to arm consumers with more information about employment opportunities, and we need companies to disclose pay and training practices. We need to invest more in workforce training. So there's a lot that can be done, but it can't be done solely. We need Congress to help with that, and we need that kind of partnership to come together. And, you know, I'm an optimist, Ted, as I always say. You know, I'm a believer that we're going to figure this out.
Yeah, just a little factoid on the worker retraining piece. If you look at the OECD countries, the 34 nations that are part of the wealthy world, the United States spends less on retraining on active labor market programs than any other OECD country except for Mexico and Chile. We spend a seventh and eighth of what the Europeans do. So it's an area where we have absolutely fallen behind.
And this conference is about competitiveness. I fundamentally believe the countries that win the war on talent are going to win in the long run, and we've got to do more. And that's why we made, you know, during my tenure, we made workforce training a priority at the Department of Commerce. We're not the Department of Labor. We're not trying to supplant them. but we need businesses to recognize that and the government together, that we can no longer afford a just-in-time provision of employees and skilled workers, that we're going to have to spend more and invest more in our workforce to be able to address the opportunities of the 21st century.
I think that's absolutely critical. David, I want to turn to you. Actually, before I ask you my question, I want to tell you my favorite UPS story. Some years ago, I was off in the California desert on this little dirt road, kind of in the middle of nowhere, thinking I was more or less lost. And suddenly this UPS truck comes up the road, headed to somewhere. I guess there was a house down there, so I would have made a great ad for your company. So I figured if the UPS truck could find his way there, I could probably find my way out. So thank you. I want to ask you a similar question from the perspective of business. You have been a strong voice in support of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which probably everybody in the room is familiar with, but the agreement that would link the United States to Japan and 10 other Asia-Pacific countries, and for trade more broadly. However, based on the election rhetoric and the results, it seems there is a public perception that trade doesn't benefit ordinary Americans, that it only benefits big companies like yours. How do you respond to that?
You know, first, I'd like to just follow up on something that Secretary Pritzker said, and that is the visual of the factory that has shut down for whatever reason. It could be trade, it could be for automation or productivity, but for whatever reason that is shut down, that is going to have an effect on everyone in this room. What's much harder to see is the jobs that are created that are just part of these different companies that are created due to trade. Give you an example of our company. We have 440,000 employees worldwide, but every 22 packages that crosses the U.S. border, either export or import, that creates or supports a UPS job. And when you think about that, that multiplies upon itself. But it's real hard to show that picture. And it's real hard to show that many of the companies in the U.S. that do export, it's hard to show that they have additional employees, or in some cases that they would not exist without being able to trade with other countries. So, you know, we just have to make sure that sometimes the perception is not the same as reality. And in this case, there were a lot of perceptions that we were not able as a group, I think, to convince people of the facts. And this is one of those misperceptions, Ted, that you just mentioned. It's easy to say that it's the large companies that will benefit from a trade agreement like TPP. But you know, large companies, the UPSs, IBMs, GEs of the world, they already know how to export. They have expertise, they have the resources. They are exporting today under very more difficult circumstances, but they are. What gets overlooked is these small and mid-sized companies, which I would make the argument that they get affected more by these trade barriers than the large companies ever have. And it's these small companies that don't have the expertise. Their export department may be 1/2 of one person's job that's doing 10 other things, right? So they can't invest in the expertise of trying to learn these different restrictions. They don't have the money to invest. And so what we need to do is we need to harmonize trade regulations. We need to make it easier to cross borders. We need to eliminate the paperwork. We need to remove tariffs, all of the things that TPP and the other trade agreements were meant to do. And that's where I think that we've got to get the message across with the new administration and with the American public, is that right now in the United States, less than 2% of small and mid-sized companies export. Less than 2%. And of those 2% that do, half just export to one country, maybe to Canada if they're on the northern border, or to Mexico. There is opportunity lost there. And the biggest reason we've been able to identify is that people don't know how to get through the difficulty of trade. And so, and you compare that to Germany or many other countries, and you're going to find that the percent of small and mid-sized companies that export is tremendously higher than that. So I firmly believe there's a strong argument to be made that these small and mid-sized companies are the ones that would benefit the most. And we have to make sure that we continue to talk that message and continue to make our points. That as part of competitiveness, we've got to be able to trade with other countries, other markets.
Secretary Pritzker, you wanted to add something to that? Or?
Yeah, I just couldn't agree more with David. I mean, you know, basically 98% of exporters are small and medium-sized businesses. If you think about what a trade agreement does for those folks, it insists that the partner countries have to be clear about what are their customs and how does customs work. It makes them say they have to be clear what are those tariffs and how do they work. They can't just change them on the dot or allow you to keep your goods sitting in the warehouse for months or weeks where either goods spoil or they can't get out. That's what trade agreements do. They help us shape trade. They allow, for example, logistics companies, you know, small business, I ran a bunch of businesses, some of which were small, and you know, you rely on a logistics company like UPS. A bunch of these countries don't allow the logistics companies to work effectively in their country. So that puts our companies at a disadvantage. So it's the devil's in the details. It's hard to paint that picture. Obviously, we haven't done it effectively enough yet, but I don't think we should give up because this is fundamental. Just remember, at the end of the day, only 5% of the marketplace is in the United States.
That's right.
I want to push on this a little bit because, you know, I have been part of a lot of these kinds of conversations in Washington about the benefits of trade, and it seems to be very hard to get it to sink in out there. I sort of have a theory, which is, you know, the last 30, 40 years, we've seen the march of trade liberalization, and the complaints have come from people who feel like they were on the losing end, and there are people who have been on the losing end. If we get to a point where we're actually slapping tariffs on imports and other countries are retaliating against us, I suspect we're going to hear from all those people who benefit from trade about the damage it does. But how do you get them engaged? I mean, what do you do at your company, for instance, at UPS, to try to engage your workforce or the small businesses that rely on you to try to tell that story? Because I feel like in a lot of ways, we have these conversations in Washington. They do not get down to the level where they need to get down to.
Right. You know, we call it an all-of-the-above strategy, and I appreciate the comments that Secretary Pritzker said about our involvement. But we started from the eyes of our customers, looking at TPP and other trade agreements, and we realized that it was something that was going to help them more. And by the way, if they increase their business, obviously it helps us too, right? So there's no doubt about that. But talking to customers, talking to our employees, and one of the things that an average driver at UPS understands clearly, the more packages you have, the more jobs it's going to create. And that is the message that we started there. Now, an international package, because especially now, there are more difficulties, more things you have to do, is going to drive even more driver jobs and other jobs. But I think we have to switch the argument a little bit and really talk about competitiveness and how these trade agreements can help increase American competitiveness. And that's a little bit different story, and it's a story that we want to share with the new administration. And it's not all about trade, but it's certainly part of it is about trade, and the fact that 95% of the world's consumers outside the U.S., that is opportunity, you know. You can look at it fearful, but that is opportunity for American businesses. So how can we improve competitiveness? The first thing is this retraining, and you talked about there was only 2 OECD countries that spend less time on training. We have to get the workforce today ready for 21st century type jobs. And to think that we can bring back manufacturing of 10 and 15 years ago where a lot of manual labor would be involved, That may bring back good memories, but that's just not reality of what's going to happen. If companies do come back and start to manufacture more in the U.S., you got to believe that there's going to be a lot of automation and a lot of artificial intelligence. A lot of things are going to be utilized because of effectiveness and productivity. So the key is not to try to bring back jobs that people would be able to do, but it doesn't require special skills, but to give people skills to where they can participate in this 21st century business environment, which is going to be crossing borders. Often the supply chains go all across, but to give them those capabilities, because the U.S. is such an innovative place, and there's so many jobs, even when you create automated facilities, drives a lot of engineers. It drives a lot of mechanical engineering and mechanics jobs and things like that. So that is one key part of this, is getting people equipped for these jobs so that they don't feel left out. And they do have a point. Don't argue that at all. Second is infrastructure. I don't think you can talk about American competitiveness without talking about infrastructure. And we used to have probably the best infrastructure when you go back years ago, but many countries have passed us by now. And you can think of bridges, you can think of roads, ports, airports. All of it is holistic. It all fits together, you're right. And digital infrastructure too. There's so much we need to do there that will allow American companies to be more competitive. And then a third one is corporate tax reform. We just have an uncompetitive rate out there now that does not encourage companies to invest in the United States. And that is something that we think is very important for this competitiveness too. We want these good American companies to have the incentive, the motivation to bring profits back that they may have acquired in other places and use them in the U.S. And we think that a combination of those things, trade where it benefits the people, infrastructure, and corporate tax reform, could help make the U.S. much more competitive, and that's the approach we're taking.
Secretary Pritzker, let me basically let you follow up on that. If you were going to give a list to the new administration of those initiatives that would make the United States a more competitive economy, would those three, retraining, infrastructure, corporate tax reform, be at the top of your list? Would there be others that you would include in that? How do we make the United States an attractive place for investment going forward so that more of these jobs are created here and address some of these concerns?
So let's first take stock of where we're at. For the last 4 years, A.T. Kearney said the United States is the #1 place in the world to invest. So we're pretty competitive today. So the first thing is, let's double down on what's working. We have rule of law, but that means we've got to have a Congress that's working and adjusting and adapting, creating incentives so we do more training and we make it easier for companies to support training. We have strong intellectual property protections. We got to keep that. We have world-class universities. We have to keep making sure that they're doing globally competitive R&D. We've got stable financial markets. Let's not screw that up, right? Because it's important that we're not creating bubbles, but that we've got a strong financial system. We need affordable energy, which we've got. We have a lot of energy capability. That's very important. And we've got fabulously talented people. What should we be doing on top of that? We need to double down on what's working. We need to double down, and we also need to, I totally agree, we need to invest in our infrastructure. We need to, corporate tax reform. These are things that we've argued for that we weren't able to get done. So I'm hopeful that the next administration will be able to get some of these things done. Trade is absolutely essential. We need access to markets to sell the things that we make. But we've got to make sure, let's not kid ourselves, automation and digitization and globalization aren't going away. So we need to make sure that we have a dynamic system that is able to help Americans be successful over decades, not over, short periods. And I think, again, I just will say we got to win the war for talent, and that's where, there's work that can be done by businesses to lead, but by Congress to create some opportunities for incentives for that to happen. What we cannot do is get in a trade war, because there will be retaliation. I have traveled in this job. I think I've been to not quite 40 countries, but I promise you, if we get in a trade war and just put up big tariffs, there will be retaliation, and that will have horrific impact on jobs, on our GDP, on income. So that's not where we need to go. Some of the other things, though, that we can also do, more apprenticeships. We've called for doubling apprenticeships. We've added 125,000. We need to do more of that. That's working. We need to double down on Manufacturing USA, which is our advanced manufacturing institutes. We've got 9, I think, up and operating. We'll have 13 by the end of the year. This is where the private sector and public sector have come together to take new technologies that have market potential, get them from lab to market in 5 to 7 years, because we have to stay on the cutting edge. We have to continue to invest in R&D. These are also things that we have to do. And finally, I'm going to make an argument for comprehensive immigration reform. And the reason I make this argument is, look, we need talent in this country. And what we know is 40% of our Fortune 500 companies and a significant portion of our venture capital-backed businesses today are led by immigrants. And over 50% of our PhDs and our master's students in the STEM fields come from foreign countries. And we ask those people to leave. We need to keep a talent in this country, and we have a moral obligation to the people who are living here and have been living here for a long time to find them a path to citizenship. And so, I think that and there's plenty of economic argument for all of that.
David, I'm a little worried that we are going to leave a misleading impression for this audience that all of these positive things are going to be on the agenda in the next administration. I think it's pretty clear, if you've listened to Donald Trump, that his trade agenda is very different, right? He wants renegotiation of NAFTA. He's threatened tariffs on China, wants to call him a currency manipulator. If we assume that the Trans-Pacific Partnership is dead, or at least dormant for a considerable period of time, the TTIP negotiations with Europe are obviously in a great deal of trouble. What does the collapse of the trade agenda mean for your company and more broadly for U.S. business? Where does that leave us?
Well, the first thing I would say is we're not, at this point, ready to say that TPP or these other trade agreements are dead. Obviously, there's a different audience. There's a different level of interest. But if you listen on the campaign trail, one of the things that came out is you never really heard anti-trade. You heard we have to have better terms, we have to have better trade agreements. The point that we want to make with the next administration is that this is important from a competitiveness standpoint, that there is so much opportunity out there. And if there's a different way to do these trade agreements, or if they can work with other countries and alter or change some of the terms, we still think trade's important. That doesn't change. Now the argument should be, okay, what's the best terms that we may or may not be able to negotiate? So the message is still, I think it's up to business leaders and others to still talk about the importance of trade, just understanding the approach is going to be different, the audience is going to be different, and the timetable is obviously going to be different. We were hoping to see something before the end of the year. I think it's a pretty fair assumption that's not going to happen, right? And we're going to have to let the new administration get in, and they're going to have to determine their policy. But we are hopeful that their policy will address trade, and that we can take advantage of the opportunities we've identified. The trade war thing, too, that Secretary Pritzker talked about, I agree with everything she said about that. But one other factor of a trade war is it's going to reduce the purchasing power of every American living here, right? Because if you start putting tariffs, and if other companies start retaliating, then it's going to drive the cost up for everyone. And if you do that, some of the people that feel left out now in trade could be affected even more if the cost of goods start to rise. So there's a complete story here, and we're optimistic. We're not going to say that we're optimistic as far as our short timetable, but we think there's enough argument out there that with the new administration, that there will be a trade policy that we think can still make a difference in this country.
Secretary Pritzker, I want to push a little more on this enforcement piece, because you warned about the dangers of a trade war. David Abney did the same. But I think often we end up with this kind of bifurcated conversation where it's, well, we either have to use the WTO, you take countries to dispute settlement, it takes 2 years to resolve, 3 years to resolve, or else if we act unilaterally, then we risk triggering a trade war. I think there is a lot of frustration. I've even had talks with US officials who said to me, you know, it used to be, if you go back to the Reagan administration, we had these various intermediate tools. Now it seems like it's either kind of WTO dispute or we don't do very much. What are ways moving forward to enforce trade rules more effectively? Because you know there are problems out there. You know, China probably the biggest, but certainly other places. But to enforce trade rules in a better way without the risk of triggering a damaging trade war.
Well, I think that there's a number of things that we do. First of all, you know, aside from bringing a case, what happens before all of that? We engage at the Department of Commerce with countries all over, in fact, all over the world. The Chinese will be here Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, where we will talk about these difficult issues, whether it's excess capacity in steel or the ability to sell our beef into China, or pharmaceutical approvals. I mean, so we are working on these issues, frankly, constantly with different countries around the world, and trying to get greater access for our companies and greater access for our products, and try and fight the market access challenges that are impediments that we face, whether it's in China or in other places around the world. So that's one thing. In terms of enforcement, you know, enforcement is really important, and we take it really seriously and have taken it really seriously. In fact, last year, Congress gave us even more money for anti-dumping and countervailing duties, which we do at the Department of Commerce, because we have the most number of anti-dumping cases. That's when industry comes to our enforcement and compliance department and says, hey, we're being dumped at unfair prices. Please to do something about it. And then we work with all the parties to figure out what the facts are, and if that's true, we put tariffs in place. And you know, we have the most number of findings in, you know, since the last couple of decades, half of which are steel, which is a huge problem, but it's actually starting to have an effect. Believe it or not, the steel industry and the Steel Workers Union actually thanked us for our work, because they're starting to see actually prices rise, jobs are growing again, you know, but it's a painful process. But we've been working closer and closer with Customs and Border Control. It requires interagency cooperation to do this well. We've taken it very seriously. We should double down on that. It works. We should continue to double down. We should make sure the resources are there so that we can have, and if we do, you know, get more trade agreements done, we need more enforcement capability, because you got to hold people accountable. That's not free. Enforcement's not free. Yep. It's something you got to invest in.
Yeah. We have some good questions coming in from the audience, so I think I may turn directly to those. There's one for Mr. Abney from a student at the University of Louisville, which has a great partnership with UPS. The question is, and this is a really interesting one, how can we help companies move to Appalachia where old industries are decaying? Teaching ex-coal miners to code is helpful, but not when software companies do not move to Pikeville and Ashland. This is a great this is a great question, because, you know, the places where the negative impacts are, it's often very hard to think, you know, what kinds of industry, what kinds of business can we bring to those locations? Is the only choice for those people to move somewhere else? Are there ways to address that challenge of some of these communities that get left behind?
Yes, there is, and I'm not going to say that it's going to be easy, obviously, but the first thing that comes to mind is digital trade is now the great equalizer that's out there. And what I mean by that is when I was your age, which was a long time ago, by the way, but when I was your age, location was the most important thing, you know, and whether it was in your part of the country in coal mines, or for me in Mississippi, it was cotton plantations, but it was all about geography. And then even local competitors were really just focused on that local community. Now with this digital transformation, we can get to markets from any part of the world to another. And it does, going back to trade agreements, it does talk about the importance of that. But an entrepreneur in the most rural part of Kentucky or any other state that you want to mention, if they come up with the right idea and they think there's a market for it, through this digital transformation, they can reach out and reach people all across the world. We have to make it easy for those entrepreneurs, that's the small enterprises that we talked about, to be able to reach those markets. And that's why we think the trade deals were so important, but it's also why we think it's very important that data and the flow of data is really unrestricted across the world, because you've got to be able to reach other places. Now, also to go back to more of a location thing, is you got to start with education, and you have to start with retraining people, but again, not training people on jobs that are going away, but training people on jobs that are reflective of what's going to go on in the next 20 and 30 years. So in some cases, yeah, it is, location is important. In other cases, I don't think not nearly as much as it used to be. And it can allow communities to diversify so that when one industry starts to fade out, that people can be trained and prepared to go into other areas.
I have a question for Secretary Pritzker that kind of follows on from Ed Martin's at World Boston, and he asked, what do we do with all the people whose jobs are lost to automation? I like that because I see, the competition from trade and the effects of technology is in some ways pushing in the same way. They both are displacement effects of one sort or another, and world trade is slowing, so we may see in the future fewer people who are dislocated by trade competition, but certainly if you look at the coming technologies, artificial intelligence, driverless cars, we're probably going to see more of that. So how do we deal going forward with what's likely to be the next big set of dislocations?
I think the idea that any of us are going to have one career for 30 or 40 years is a fallacy going forward. And I think Americans understand that. I think it's creating a lot of anxiety. But to be able to cope, we've got to, it's exactly what David said. We've got to invest not only in, whether it's automation or globalization, we have to invest in individuals. We've got to invest in education. We've got to give people the tools for the next sort of jobs. And that means we have to learn new skills. And we have to be able to do that not just when we're in high school or in college or in graduate school. We've got to be doing it throughout our lives. And we've got to change the way we think about education and training. If you think about, I went to law school, but I never practiced law. Lawyers every year have to go back to school. Every year to just keep their license, they have to go back to school.
My wife is a teacher. They have to do that regularly too.
Yeah. We've got to do this for other sectors of our economy. It's the idea that you could, that because things are changing and they're changing more rapidly. And so that's why we've got to be investing more in workforce training. And we've got to make it easier for businesses to lead that effort, because the reality is federal government can't do that. Local government can support, but they can't do it. At the end of the day, businesses know what they need and what they're going to need. We need to incent businesses to be able to have that kind of leadership. We need to encourage that. We need to support it. Because at the end of the day, your most valuable asset, wherever they are your people. I mean, that's absolutely true. I don't care what business you're in, are your people. So we've got to now recognize we've underinvested in our people. We've got to invest more. And we can't just say, oh, I'm sorry, your job's gone, goodbye. We've got to recognize that just-in-time people is not okay. We're going to have to really invest in our folks and help them.
Hey, Ted,
Okay,
I would like to just follow up on the automation piece for a minute.
Okay, and then I'm going to throw you another tougher question. So,
Okay.
but go ahead, follow up on automation.
Then I'm going to stall for a while then, right? But I get asked that. UPS is in the process of automating our company, and we have absolutely no choice. Now, automation doesn't mean that you don't need people anymore. It does mean that you change jobs, and that a lot of these typical jobs could go away, but it creates other opportunities. But you can't look at it that automation is just going to eliminate jobs, so it's bad. What you have to understand, if companies don't automate, they're not going to be they're not going to be competitive, and they're going to get smaller, and they're going to need less people, and it's going to cause that same effect. So for us, we think the best thing we can do for our people is to continue to automate our facilities, drive our competitiveness up, find ways that we can add more value, create additional jobs because we're growing the business at twice what we would be able to grow if we weren't automating. So we don't think it's the wrong thing to do for people. We think embracing the future and charging ahead with all the technologies that are available will allow us to create opportunities, but it will be creating opportunities that are going to need certain skills.
Okay, so we have a great consensus up here. We should be investing more in infrastructure. We should be investing more in education. We should be doing more worker retraining. But I've got a questioner here who asks, let's assume the government's not going to raise taxes. In fact, you want a corporate tax cut, even though the corporate share of federal tax revenue is lower than it's ever been. How are we going to pay for this stuff? And we all agree this needs to be done, but who's going to pay for it? How does it get paid for?
Okay.
I'll throw that to you first, because you asked for the corporate tax cut.
That's
so,
right. What I was talking about is corporate tax reform, you know, and we are not pressing for something that's going to be less revenue to the government. If it's revenue neutral, we're okay with that. But we think there's so much opportunity for reform that would drive jobs and stimulate the economy. UPS has a very high effective tax rate. So when you hear about companies that don't pay taxes or pay a very low tax rate, that's just not the case with our situation. But we have competition that is not based in the U.S. that has tax rates 10% or so less than ours. We're at a 10% disadvantage just from the very beginning. So a couple of things we're pushing. One is we want a permanent stability, a stable tax policy that we can depend on and know what it's going to be. Second, we do want a competitive tax rate that would be along the lines of what you see in the other OECD countries. In order to get that tax rate, we are willing, and I've heard many other businesses are willing to give up or have rescinded or have reduced some of these tax benefit clauses that are out there. And so even though you'd be reducing the overall rate, it could be more revenue neutral if you take away some of these special benefits that have been passed over the years. And lastly, part of this is through some kind of territorial tax, allowing U.S. businesses to bring funds back that are captive now in other parts of the world, bring them back without a penalty for domestic use. There again, that will create opportunities and stimulate the economy. So we're not looking as a business group saying we just got to pay less just so that we can add to our profits. But there's a competitiveness issue out there where other countries are are paying, other companies are paying much less taxes than other countries. And there's going to be winners and losers, but we don't think we should be looking to find every tax loophole that we can find, that's the way to solve the problem. The way to solve it is to get that competitive rate.
And I think we could see this be on the agenda for the new administration. Secretary Pritzker, we have a question here actually about investment. We've talked mostly about trade, but the work you've done on investment is very important. Complementing the work you've done in advancing bilateral investment and trade cooperation here, specifically with Ukraine, but with other countries as well. What would your advice be to the next administration in promoting and advancing investment opportunities for U.S. business abroad? And I'm going to throw in improving opportunities for foreign companies to invest in the United States, because I think the expansion of Select USA is going to be one of your real legacies in the department. But what do you see as the investment agenda going forward?
Yeah, I think that one of the, I think, most exciting things that we've done as an administration is to double down and really go after foreign companies to invest here in the United States, to take advantage of all the things I talked about, which is our strong rule of law, our intellectual property protection, our strong financial system, and our extraordinary people, as well as our commitment to R&D. That's made the United States #1 place to invest the last 4 years. We never had a process to actually go out and help companies do that. We did that with Select USA. We created an organization. We've got about 35 people, about a $10 million budget. That $10 million budget has helped create $22 or $3 billion worth of investment over the last 18 months into the United States. We know that about 5.6 million Americans go to work at U.S. subsidiaries of foreign companies. It's good for America. So that's been a really important effort. Investment in the United States is something that we've been all over, because it's good for productivity. It's also good for job creation. I think David makes a really important point. Our tax code today is not really set up to encourage investment in the United States. It encourages you to leave as a company your cash offshore because you paid less taxes there, so invest, and it encourages you to borrow here in the United States because you get a deduction for interest rates, for interest payments here in the United States. We need to straighten that out so that a company like UPS or any other company, large or small, says, hey, I'm going to go where it's the best environment for me to either make my goods or provide my services. I'm not investing someplace because of the tax disadvantage I have because of our current structure. And it's time we have to address that. That means Congress has got to take action. And this is, we need to get, it's time, and I'm hopeful that, we'll see some of these reforms occur over the next year or so.
What about the outward investment piece? I mean, we're negotiating a bilateral investment treaty with China. Improving investment opportunities overseas has been a priority for administrations for years and years. Do you see new challenges on that horizon, or are we in a pretty good place there? Or?
Well, we have a number of bilateral investment treaties that are under negotiation. I'll tell you, every country that, that I've met where we don't have one wants a bilateral investment treaty. The question is on what terms? And this again goes back to trade agreements, bilateral investment treaties. These are the way we shape trade. And they're really important, and they're really, it's good that countries want this with the United States. What we can't do is lower our standards. What we have to do is say, no, if we're going to do business with you, we got to do it so it's good for the American worker, good for the American people, good for American companies. And that's what we've tried to do. And that makes them hard to do because it often requires reform in the country you're negotiating with. I mean, China is having to make, in order to negotiate the bilateral investment treaty, which they very much want to see done, as do American companies want to see done, is they're having to open up more and more of the sectors of their economy to investment. That's good for American workers. It's good for American companies.
We have a question for David from Coles, Ohio, and it's on this talent development. The question says, the talent pipeline starts young. What should K-12 education look like? Teaching what sort of skills so that as the economy adapts, as the economy changes, professionals can adapt? And the questioner has to speak to global competence. Just a sort of shout out for my own organization, the Council on Foreign Relations, has been doing a lot more work in trying to teach global literacy in the schools. We're developing programs trying to get it out there in the schools because there is, I mean, frankly, a kind of shocking level of ignorance about the world among a lot of Americans. I think there are challenges there. But if you're looking down as far as K to 12, what would you recommend at that level to prepare people for the world you're talking about?
Well, that would have been the first area that I would have mentioned. And I became the international president of UPS back in 2002. And that was, I had traveled and represented UPS in other jobs across other countries, but that entire job was going to other countries, right? And I didn't have the domestic operations, I had the international. And what you find out is that most of the rest of the world understand so much more of what's going on in the world than people in the U.S. do. They speak multiple languages. You know, it makes sense in Europe, right? Because you got different countries with different languages that are very close. But I really think one of the failings of our education system is there's too much emphasis on what's going on in the U.S. and people just don't understand, whether it's K to 8 or if it's in universities. You know, something as simple to those of us, and most everyone in this group, in this room, would be very sophisticated about different parts of the world. But you could ask a typical American to talk about Singapore. Is it a city? Is it a state? Is it a country? And more times than not, it seems like at least the people I talk to, they think it's located somewhere in China, you know. And my point is not ridiculing Americans because we've been able to accomplish so much as a country, but saying that from an educational standpoint, it's got to be a lot more about what's going on in the rest of the world, understanding other cultures, understanding other countries, and then, of course, when you get into the older grades, is really looking at what skills are going to be necessary for people as they're competing in the new generations to come, and then getting them prepared. One of the things that my educational friends talk about now is not enough emphasis on science, not enough emphasis on math. It seems like a lot of times we rely on immigrants that come in from other countries in some of these key jobs because we're not finding as many qualified Americans as companies would need. And then anything we can do for our kids to give them exposure to other places and other worlds, whether it's you know, doing it virtually, you can still do it, but if it's opportunities to send kids to other countries so that they can see other cultures and realize that many of these places, they're not our enemy. They're not people that have to lose so that we can win. I mean, the real key to success in the world is finding ways that we can all win and we can lift all boats, right? So I think there is good opportunities. I am not the expert that could really break down, you know, a 10-point plan of what we need to do about American education, but that's just a few things that I have seen.
Yeah, we've got 5 minutes left, so I'm going to ask one last question for each of you, and given the short time, you're going to have to put it kind of in a soundbite, and that may be important to answering this question effectively. I mean, we really have seen the breakdown, I've seen it over my lifetime, of the consensus in this country about the benefits of trade. I mean, you go back to the congressional vote on the Tokyo round in 1979, it was 395 to 7 in the House in favor of the Tokyo round. By NAFTA, we were down 234 to 200 with a majority of Bill Clinton's Democrats voting against NAFTA. By the time of the Central American Free Trade Agreement of the Bush administration, it passed by 2 votes after the vote got held open and people were bought and hold. So we've seen, and now finally it looks like the TPP is, if not dead, at least dormant. How do we rebuild a consensus in this country on the benefits of trade. And it's got to be short, both because of our time and because it's got to actually get out to the American people in a way they can appreciate. I'll start with you, Secretary Pritzker.
I think we have to do two things. I think we have to, and just to be very simplistic about it, we have to be able to tell people that this is good for jobs in America. And the second is we have to tell people that if you're displaced, there's a safety net that actually works. It's reliable and it works. And if we can't overcome those two things, I think that I think it's very hard.
Dave.
I think we have to talk, there's two avenues or two paths we can go. One is to get real focused on our country and try to get all the manufacturing in our country to occur here and really shut ourselves from the rest of the market. If you do that, that's 95% of the consumers. And we haven't really talked about it in this room, but emerging markets are going to create tremendous opportunities for some country and their exporters. We believe it should be the United States. So we believe you have to look at this as an opportunity, that it creates jobs, that it spurs the economy, but we do have to do the things we talked earlier to prepare people and allow them to partake in the advantages of trade.
Secretary Pritzker, you had one final thought.
Yeah, one final thought. We ultimately have to get politics out of the discussion, and we have to talk facts and reality. And right now, we've got this thing all covered up in politics, and we need to peel that onion back, and we need to actually say, what's this really going to mean if we don't do trade, and if we do trade? And then when I say safety net, I don't mean a big handout program. I mean helping people transition from one job to another if they're truly disaffected, and they got to be able to rely on that.
Yeah, and to hawk my own book, we've had a failure to adjust, so we actually need to have policies that help people adjust going forward.
Yeah.
I would like to thank our speakers for a tremendous and timely conversation. Thank you.
That was great.